Welcome back, readers, listeners, and viewers. This has been fun getting into the YouTube side of things, and I really hope to kind of branch out and generate more content here. And it's been fun going through my first book, Rebel Heart. Definitely not the first book that I wrote. I wrote dozens before that. This was the first one that I made the serious attempt to publish. And as I'm reading through it, I'm finding some continuity errors that I made earlier on with minor characters that kind of got bigger as the rest of the series expanded. So it was definitely a learning experience in creating a trilogy and crafting a much larger world where I was focusing more than just on the focal characters. Chapter 5 still has us at Mount Vernon. Calvin has now successfully executed a raid. I promise I can talk. A raid on a mage farm. They got some supplies, and he has taken his first life. I struggled with how to deal with the fallout of that. It's something that kind of develops over time. One of the undercurrent themes in this series is how people are recruited into the war effort at a very young age. And in fact, at the end of this book, you're going to meet a character who is 18, but he's been in the war for 10 years. He was effectively a child soldier, and you see some of the psychological cost of that. And Calvin's arc deals with, him trying to figure out, when to fight and why to fight. He's got that. He's got that instinct to rebel against power structures, but there are costs to that as the story develops, as the trilogy develops, and you'll see that. I'm really proud of his arc, and really proud of what I was able to learn in the creativity process and in the construction process as I put this whole series together. So tonight's chapter is only 5 pages, and then after that I got a surprise for you with a behind-the-scenes look at the art as promised. So without further ado, here's chapter 5. The character one shot beforehand is of Brian McCracken, and you'll get a much better look at him in a moment. The weight of firing his blunderbuss directly into a mage would not leave Calvin's conscience any time soon. He tried to remember all of the bad things that Fitznottingham and Birtwistle had done to his friends and family, but that didn't help. The mage Calvin shot was not Fitznottingham or Birtwistle. He was somebody Calvin did not know, and yet... Back at the dormitory, the recruits were bustling with tales of triumph, comparing stories with one another. Calvin quietly confided his concerns to Stitch, who'd already been through one traumatic plight on a farm. "Yeah, it's a weighty thing to know you've killed a man. I don't know what else you could have done if he was going to go for Brian," Stitch said. "Well, it's not like it would have been some great loss," Calvin grumbled. "One less McCracken, right?" Stitch said. "Right," Calvin smiled. "Dime a dozen around here." He wondered if Amelia had thought of him today. If Brian McCracken felt any gratitude toward Calvin for dropping that mage, he had a funny way of showing it. Training for the next morning had been cut short after the swim session. Peter took the other recruits back to the stables to clean the equipment, but Brian put Calvin in charge of stocking the supplies they had stolen from the British farm. Not only was Rusty and Stitch's cart full, but 2 others besides, and the pantry where they stored their goods was meticulously organized. "Keep it this way. Everything straight and orderly," Brian said, after showing Calvin around. "Hop to it, kid." "We're the same age," Calvin thought, fuming. He ached to be outside with his fellow cadets. Instead, he had to catalog grains and beans by weight, scribble the numbers into a ledger, and pack it all into cans. How would this help him fight the British Empire? He could not see how. Part of him suspected that Brian was jealous of Calvin for hurting a mage, while all he'd done was throw bombs at cows. Maybe Brian wanted the other cadets to get better at technomancy than Calvin. "Brian, Oh." Calvin nearly dropped a 10-pound can of dried corn on his toes. Amelia stood in the entryway to the pantry, her hair double-braided again, her skirt and blouse partially covered by an apron that was smudged from the day's work. Hello, Amelia," he said. His face felt hot. "I didn't expect to see you here. Normally this part is Brian's job," Amelia said. Calvin breathed in the soft vanilla scent that seemed to float off of Amelia's skin. Brian could dump his chores on Calvin any time if it worked out this way. How have you been? She asked, moving over to the scale and picking up a ledger where he'd left off. They easily fell into a working rhythm, as if they'd done this many times before. Busy, Calvin said, waving a hand at the food. As you can see. This is a good haul. Could use some more meat, but that's easy to come by, she said. I just had to clean out the inside of the shark mimic. Dirty job, that. Your dad won't let you study with the cadets, but he'll let you clean the mimics? Calvin asked. He thinks it'll keep me out of trouble. Amelia grinned and lowered her voice conspiratorially. He doesn't know, but I have taken the shark out a couple of times, just up and down the river. You can drive that thing? Yes, it's so great. You're going to love piloting one. Oh, here. She handed him a canvas sack of apples. His hand brushed hers as he took it, and his ears burned. He wondered if this was how it went when a girl fancied you, or if she was just being friendly. He told himself not to overthink it. There were already enough ways to get in trouble with the McCrackens. Thanks, he said, putting the sack on the fruit shelf. So Brian has you doing his chores, huh? He must be afraid of you, Amelia said. Whoa, what? Calvin halted and almost dropped a can. He's done this once or twice before. If there's a recruit he doesn't like, he'll put them on remedial duties for a day or two just to slow them down. Makes them look worse on paper so they get grunt work assignments when it comes time to go into the field, Amelia said. That prat. Wait, so that means I'm good at all this? Amelia shrugged. So far, yeah. But you guys haven't even started the good stuff. Next week, if you keep the schedule, you'll start mimic simulations. If I keep the schedule, Calvin muttered, stalking another can. She lowered her voice. Don't be in such a rush to hit the field. I've seen thousands of recruits graduate from training, but it's always the same people in charge who pass back through. You don't think they all die out there, do you? Calvin asked. Well, no. I mean, sure, some do, but mostly I meant... She looked down and bit her lip. Was he imagining the flush of red in her cheeks? You're not in a rush to run off and get killed, are you, Calvin? Definitely not. I'm here to run off and... He thought about saying, do some killing, but he didn't want to think of the mage again. And fight for something worthwhile. Amelia stopped writing in the ledger and rested her hands on the counter. Why do you feel that way, Calvin? He pursed his lips and recalled the tea merchant in Boston, telling Amelia a brief version of the story. Before my dad could take me away from there, I asked a man in the crowd what was going on. I wondered why the captain had thrown away his own goods. The man, the bystander, looked at me like I'd asked him why the sun comes up every morning. I'll always remember what he said. Them tea makers are standing up for what's theirs, kid. Better to go broke for freedom than to smile with someone's boot on your neck. Wow, Amelia said, listening with great interest. Is that why you joined up, Calvin? To go broke in the fight? I came here because John Penn's crew snuck into my house and gave me a really lopsided choice, Calvin admitted. That's how you got here, but that's not why you're here, Amelia said. Calvin thought it over. I guess, to be honest, I don't know why I'm here. Not just yet, but, well, he felt his face flush again as he met her eyes with his. I found a reason to enjoy it, for what that's worth. There was a long silence between them. Amelia's cheeks really did go red, and she looked away. I know what you mean. The pantry door swung open with a hard crack. Both of them jumped a mile as Commodore McCracken pushed his way inside, carrying 2 cured legs of pork. He almost dropped them both when he saw Calvin and Amelia in the enclosed space. Amelia, why aren't you at the docks? He snapped. Calvin didn't like how she flinched at her father's voice. Calvin, Brian made him come in here and he didn't know. You were supposed to clean the shark mimic, McCracken said. I did. It's already clean. Then clean something else. Go on, get. As Amelia scuttled out of the pantry, McCracken set his fiery gaze on Calvin. Calvin rooted himself to the spot, trying to convey some measure of courage, though his insides churned with uncertainty. And you, the old man seethed, stay away from my daughter or you walk home. This is your only warning. Are we clear? Crystal, Calvin said, fighting a tremble in his hands. Get out on the range. Now. Laying down some paternal warning action there, Commodore McCracken. Come on, sharpen up. Anyway, you'll get a better look at it in just a second. This is the part where we wrap up the reading portion and we jump into the artistic portion. All right. So here's the thing about this illustrating process. I did not know anything about getting it all digitized when I was done. I had been drawing my entire life. I got a whole ton of stuff here for it. You see my art supplies on this desk over here. Still working on developing skills cartooning. That's a whole other story. But I figured I would just do it the way that I had always done, with a number 2 pencil and a mechanical pencil. I would use 0.5 lead for the sharp stuff, 0.7 to kind of fill it in and give it body, and then for big areas where I had to fill it in really, really dark, I would just use the number 2 and that would be fine. And then when it came time to scan them in, I would just bunch them all up, run them down to FedEx, Kinko's, a print shop, whatever, run them through their huge scanner, and everything would be fine. But the problem is that graphite reflects light like crazy. Let's see if we can get it to do it here. You'll see how it reflects and it shines like that. Well, scanners use light to pick all that up, and so instead of it showing up dark black like it was supposed to, it reflected brightly. It almost looked like there were patches of white in all of the art. So when it came time to digitize those, I recruited the help of my late sister Moray. She died last summer of a brain tumor, but the work that she did on this book and on Suicide Run, actually I think she did it on all 3, will live forever in this trilogy, where she helped me get them physically into the book. Even then, some of the white background space didn't brighten up all that clearly, which is what you saw with, for example, the picture of Amelia McCracken, where there was kind of that dark haze around her. This is a problem that lessens over the course of the series, and it gets really, really good and clear by the time the 3rd book, Patriots Game, comes around. But I always knew that this was going to be a learning experience working on this book just because of that. I wish that initial misstep hadn't happened, but I had to learn somehow. You'll see that I did go back over and kind of darken the edges with markers and pens and stuff to make those lines really crisp. And then I used markers and pens for Suicide Run for book 2, but still filled them in with graphite. And that's when I finally learned that graphite was the problem, and I needed to use charcoal or markers, which I did for the following 2 books. But for this art review here, I've only pulled the pieces out of my storage that were from Rebel Heart. So that's Jack Badgett. That's Peter McCracken, who you've met. This is a character named Hank Duncan, who you have not met. He'll show up at the end of the book, and he features much more prominently in the sequels. This is a clearer look at the George Washington drawing that I did. Found a drawing of a horse and put him on there. And this is that grotesque ogre king. As I said, the king isn't actually an ogre. This is just a bit of wartime propaganda. There's the thumbnail sketch for this, which is also wartime propaganda. And let's see here. There, that's the one we just saw at the end of chapter 5 of Commodore McCracken. See, you can see the shine right there. If I turn the light off of it, it kind of goes away. McCracken in the pantry. There's a lot more detail up close. Again, this is something else that I had to learn the hard way, was just how much detail to apply, because when you're taking something that's on an 18 by 24 sheet and you're condensing it to a 5 by 8 book, a lot of that detail is just going to get sucked up and destroyed anyway. Speaking of detail, I put all the effort into Mount Vernon on this piece. I kind of got the proportions wrong on Calvin's body, kneeling next to the man who had his leg broken. Didn't really draw enough swine in this one. So, again, learning process, things that I realized after the fact. This is a scene that hasn't happened yet. Calvin and another technomancer have to fight off a panther in the woods. Were I to do this one again, I would take Calvin and the panther and I would blow them up and make them a much larger portion of the foreground, maybe even the other technomancer cadet that's jumping with him. I spent so much time drawing freaking trees and leaves and crap on the ground, when the more interesting subject were Calvin, the panther, and the other technomancer. I guess it kind of gives it a sense of scale, shows how big the wilderness is, but the wilderness is not the most interesting portion of this. There's Calvin killing that mage that he blew away right there. Again, you see the graphite problems. If I see there, the light on the hinge, specifically on the door, but when I hit it dead on, the problem is you can't hit the whole thing dead on at once, and that's where you end up with a lot of that metallic glare. This is another one where, this is probably the first one where scale really messed me up. These are the other 6 recruits. You've got Lila. I'm trying to remember who that one is. I'm pretty sure that's Avery, Stitch, Edsel, Rusty, and Cohen. And they all kind of get bigger roles as it goes on. What's funny is Rusty, Stitch, and Lila, like I said, those are my 3 Martin cousins. That's Allie, Jimmy, and Kara. This is my buddy Zach, who volunteered his face suit to be Edsel. You're probably going to end up not liking him all that much in the coming chapters. This is where Calvin gets in a fight with Brian. That's where Calvin gets caught again hanging out with Amelia. You'll see where. These are a couple of side characters that show up to teach the Technomancers different disciplines. Sometimes I used volunteers among my family or friends to be the face models for these characters, just so that they wouldn't all look the same. Other times I pulled certain celebrities that you couldn't possibly recognize from my handiwork, so as to not make me suable. That's Penn, Aberforth, and Cade, the recruiters who came and talked Calvin into joining up with the Technomancers. That's the drawing of Calvin from the very beginning. Those are his parents, William and Rebecca Adler. I've even dated this stuff. That was a habit that my mama made me take on with my artwork. These are 2 different drawings of the young mage Godfrey Norrington, who you met very passingly in Chapter 1. In first drafts of that chapter, we didn't really get a look into his viewpoint, but he is the primary villain of this entire series, and I needed to introduce him, I felt, a little bit earlier on than just at the very, very end of Rebel Heart, which is when we get a glimpse into him and what he's all about. Evil Joe on a flying carpet. I used the face of my young brother-in-law, Joseph, to be the villain here. These are some other characters you haven't met yet. That's Major Tyler, Captain Hamilton. This was my attempt to kind of like redraw what Carter Reed had drawn for the cover of Rebel Heart and put it in just so I could have like the scene from the cover be in the book. I felt like it came out looking like crap, so I just scratched that one. You've seen all these ones. Yeah, like this drawing of Brian came out much clearer than it ended up in the book. Same with this drawing of Amelia. And there's her again coming down the stairs with that food for Calvin. And then there is Commodore McCracken. Wizened, grizzled, all that good stuff. That's the glimpse into the theater at Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon itself is not big enough to house something like this. It's not really something that I address in this series. I've kind of headcanoned it and backstoried it to where the actual Mount Vernon may have been destroyed at some point, but was rebuilt to kind of look like the original Mount Vernon and just bigger and a lot of stuff underground. The Technomancers are big and into burrowing underground. This is the scene from the very beginning of the book where Calvin is scrubbing wool in his front yard when Fitznottingham and Burt Whistle and Godfrey come by and they start causing problems for the tanners, and Calvin takes his sluice bucket and goes and dumps it on them. I wasn't really using my paper efficiently for this one. I had these huge sheets and I was only putting one drawing on them. I had gotten this paper from an old job that I had in Vegas. There was a kind of a blueprinting architectural department there, and they had these huge packages of paper that they were just throwing out. And I grabbed them and I was like, this is 2007. I was like, I don't even know when I'm going to use all this, but wasting this much paper is just abhorrent. And I ended up using pretty much all of that to do the artwork for these 3 books and pretty much every book that I've done since then. This was a drawing from the end of the book, but I didn't end up using this one with the other recruits. I just ended up using, let's see if we can get a kind of a dark design on there. If I can get the metal look off of there. But yeah, 7th Mimic Brigade Rebel Hearts. I kind of bungled the alliteration on that one. Kind of modeled it aesthetically on the battle flag of the Army of North Virginia, aka the Confederate flag, but it's really got nothing to do with that. It was just an aesthetic that worked for rebellion. So that's what ends up at the end of the book. There's Edsel right there and Calvin as full Technomancers. They're issued their uniforms and their weaponry. This was from a training exercise that Calvin and Edsel were engaged in. That's the Adler family crest. More on that as the series develops. This is when they get their experience working on mimics. They get to practice with the engines and stuff. This was a defunct mimic. I'm trying to remember what this one was. I think it might have been an early like warg mimic. You find out later in the series that they kind of moved away from using walker mimics because they were too unruly, too hard to maintain, so they just used a lot of big flyer mimics. This was an old early model submarine. You'll see where that comes in this book. These are different chapter heading icons. I haven't really been showing you those because they're so small, but there's the pistol, there's the rifle, there's the blunderbuss, grenade, potion vial, herbs, the mages' badges, their wands and their brooms, wrenches, goggles, just trinkets, things that were obviously important and useful to different characters in the story. Calvin gets a chance to face off against the mages that were causing him so much trouble. This was one of the better drawings that I did for the book, but again, so much number 2 pencil right there that just catches light, and so the scanner screwed it up. It was really hard to get right, but Calvin has to use some of his equipment to go up against a number of mages by himself on a mission later on. This is also, Calvin operating a Dragonling mimic as he's cornered by a couple of technomancers on Griffin mimics, the 2-person seat or 2-seater mimics. Don't want to give this away. It was an interesting development of the story. That's not Calvin though. Jack Badgett, Ace American. We just got our first mention of him in this story. That's his mimic. And it's parked there in the barn, and Calvin and Edsel are fighting over a chance to take it out for a test drive. This is probably the best piece in the book. I ended up cutting it kind of down the middle digitally to make it into a 2-page spread. We'll see it later. But this is Calvin's first solo flight on a Dragonling mimic over Mount Vernon in the middle of the night. I wasted so much of this stupid number 2 pencil doing these nighttime mountains and hills and the reflection on the river. Got a lot better at different textures after that, but this was how I learned. This is a steampunk flight simulator. This conceptually is one of the things that I'm more proud of in the story. I probably spent just a little bit too much time describing it because it was a lot of fun to think about how you would make a flight simulator with steampunk technology. But yeah, this is how they train on machines when they don't have the confidence in the recruits to kind of do it themselves at that young stage in their training. So that's a glimpse at the entire run of art through Rebel Heart. You'll see more of this stuff as the following chapters come along. I think there are only 14 or 15 chapters in this book, so we're a third of the way through. Just this chapter 5 here was the shortest of them. So hope you guys have been enjoying it. Thank you for following along. And as always, please subscribe to this channel because there's going to be more content coming. And if you're into podcasts, check out the Brother Trucker Book Club podcast. That is the podcast that I do, my book reviews on, and I've even recorded one of my shorter novellas on there back in November. If you're more interested in the art side of things, definitely check out @DreadPennies on Instagram. I've moved away from doing a lot of this traditional art for my books. I still work on stuff in a sketchbook. I'm doing a draw everyday challenge for 2020. So sometimes the pieces are a little bit more elaborate when I've got time. Sometimes it's just, a quick sketch to get something down for the day. But I'm posting also the digital art that I'm doing for my current book called With Answerable Courage. And I think you'll see a big jump in skill, technique, and quality and all that stuff from the stuff I did in 2014 versus the stuff that I'm doing now 6 years later. I've always been drawing and I've been decent at it for a while, but in this last 6-year span, as I've been working on stuff that's going to end up in books, I've seen my skill improve. I'm proud of that. I've definitely got a lot farther to go to get to where I want to be. I want to be like, comic quality art like Ethan Van Sciver with his Salamandroid and Cyberfrog and all that stuff. I'm not going to get there unless I just sit down and do the work every single day. So that's why I'm here. But yeah, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications so you can see other episodes and chapters go live, and I will see you out there. Thanks for watching.